In today's lecture, we continue our discussion of the high age of European imperialism, but we switch our focus to Asia. Generally speaking, the type of imperialism we see in Asia is mostly informal, or through economic exploitation. Again, it is important to note imperialism was not new to Asia. Many Asians had colonized other Asians in previous centuries. Specifically, we will focus on Great Britain's imperialism in China, the U.S. attempt to imperialize Japan, Japanese expansion and imperialism of its neighbors, imperialism and its effects in the Persian and Ottoman empires, and finally, the U.S. imperialism of Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines. First, we'll start with China. Traditionally in Asia, China was the dominant power. They colonized much of Asia and controlled international trade through its domination of the Silk Roads from about 130 BCE until the 1500s, when international trade shifted to the seas. Even after trade shifted to the seas, China continued to be the Asian dominant power. Therefore, their goods, literature, philosophies were exported throughout the region and beyond. In fact, they developed a form of ethnocentrism in which they believed all other peoples were inferior to them. China's rulers were emperors, and like Europeans, they practiced hereditary monarchy, where the eldest son inherited the throne. However, when we talk about China, we see a pattern of shifting power called dynastic cycles, where about every 300 years power shifts from one family to another, thus giving us our different dynasties. It was believed that the family losing power lost what is called the mandate of heaven, and the family that gained power had received the mandate of heaven. In a way, this is similar to Europe's divine right of kings. In both cultures, power is derived from something immortal or otherworldly. In Europeans, this is the Judeo-Christian God. In the Chinese, it is called the mandate of heaven. The last dynasty to rule China was called the Qing or Manchu dynasty. They came from Manchuria, the northeasternmost part of China. When the Europeans learned this, they called them the Manchu, but the Chinese referred to this dynasty as Qing. You will see both terms depending on the source. The previous dynasty, the Ming, had imperialized Korea, Vietnam, and other Southeast Asians. When the Qing came to power in the mid-1600s, they expanded into Mongolia and Central Asia. This expansion hurt the economy, leading to food shortages and the desolation of farmland. By the time the British arrive in the early 1800s, the Chinese are unhappy with their rulers, whom they believe are corrupt and foreigners themselves. Great Britain wanted to buy China's teas, silks, and spices, but the Chinese did not want anything the British had to sell, or their money. In fact, they just wanted the Fanchi, or the foreign devils, to leave. They believed that they had had everything they needed within their empire, so why should they trade with them? Great Britain really wanted to trade with China, so they introduced opium to the Chinese. Yep, the British are the original drug lords of the 1800s. And they did it on the cheap. You see, opium comes from the poppy plant, which happens to grow plentifully in Great Britain's most prized colony, the crown jewel, India. So they controlled both supply and demand. By the very addictive nature of opium, there was no shortage of demand in China. Now, the Chinese realized pretty quickly that Great Britain was controlling them through the opium trade and twice went to war to try to stop them. The First Opium War began in 1839 and lasted until 1842, when the Chinese attempted to end the opium trade, first through diplomacy, and when that didn't work, they confiscated over about 20,000 chests of opium and ordered a blockade of foreign ships. Great Britain responded by sending the Royal Navy to China. They defeated the Chinese and forced them to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which gave them 5 ports and Hong Kong. As a result of the economic control of China by Great Britain and the Treaty of Nanking, many Chinese focused their frustrations on the Qing dynasty, thus resulting in a civil war when the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom tried to overthrow the Qing. Ultimately, they failed, but it was this weakened dynasty that Great Britain faced in the Second Opium War, which lasted between 1856 and 1860. Similar to the first, the Chinese tried once again to get to the British to end the opium trade. Great Britain again uses gunboat diplomacy, and together with the French, they forced the Chinese into submission, ceding more rights to foreigners. This led to more tensions between the Qing dynasty and the Chinese people. By 1900, not just the British controlled parts of China, but other countries as well. They carved out what we call spheres of influence in China. Here is a map of the spheres of influence in China from around 1910. Note that 4 out of the 5 major European powers are there, as well as Japan. They are informally colonizing China. Also note the absence of the U.S. By 1900, though, this would change when U.S. Secretary of State John Hayes introduces the open door policy, allowing trade to be open to all countries equally. The Society of Righteous Fists, known in the West as Boxers, are shown below. They were a secret society that started an anti-imperialist, anti-foreign, and anti-Christian guerrilla movement. In 1900, they converged on Beijing, calling to exterminate the foreigners. The Empress Dowager Tushi initially sided with the Boxers against the Eight-Nation Alliance, which was made up of all the European powers plus the United States and Japan. They sent 20,000 troops to end the siege of the legation corridor where the foreigners had fled for protection. After months of fighting in the capital, the foreign legation was relieved. The Empress Dowager, disguised as a peasant, fled the capital along with her nephew, the Emperor. In absentia, she negotiated with the Eight-Nation Alliance to stay in power in return for the guarantee that China would not have to give up any more territory to the foreign powers. This allowed the Qing to remain in power for 10 more years. When her nephew, the Emperor, died in 1908, she died 1 day later, but not before naming the late Emperor's nephew, Puyi, as her successor. He was only 3 years old and would be China's last emperor. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was educated in Hawaii and later studied medicine in Hong Kong. He earned his medical license in 1892. During medical school, he was baptized as a Christian. By the late 1890s, Sun quit his medical practice to become a revolutionary. He believed that the only way to end foreign domination of China was to overthrow the Qing dynasty and form a republic that would modernize on its own. He believed in 1. Nationalism under a united China, 2. Democracy, which we would today call self-determination, the right of China to choose its leaders, and 3. Socialism. The Chinese government should take care of its people through social welfare programs. Sun's revolution had many fits and starts. But in 1911, they finally succeeded when the Emperor Puyi abdicated. Sun became the father of the nation, and the Republic of China was born. He consolidated his political party with others to form the KMT Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party. Initially, he gave the presidency of China to Yuan Shikai, who controlled the army. But when in 1915 Yuan declared himself emperor, he took over the presidency until his death in 1925. When the imperial government fell, the Europeans took advantage of the situation and took over Chinese colonies like Vietnam. China's relations with the West in the 1800s was difficult. It suffered under imperialism, had many civil wars, and eventually became a republic. Japan's relations with the West are even more complicated. Let's take a look. When the first Europeans made contact with the Japanese in the 1500s, they were for feudal society. The majority of the population were peasants who worked the land owned by the daimyo. The samurai were a warrior caste of fighters. Although the archipelago was ruled by an emperor believed to be a descendant of the sun god, there was little to no centralization of power. Instead, local warlords known as shogun employed the samurai to protect the daimyo from each other. First contact was made in 1543 by a group of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors. Things did not go well. The Japanese did not take kindly to the pale-faced, harsh-talking, funnily dressed men. What's more, the "smelly barbarians" carried with them "lightning sticks," which shot fire against their enemies. This was insulting to the samurai especially, who prided themselves on swordsmanship and hand-to-hand combat. Guns were seen as a cowardly and dishonorable way to fight. Soon after, Roman Catholic missionaries arrived and attempted to convert the Japanese to Christianity and open trade. Over the next 50 years, other Europeans also came to Japan selling various consumer goods. Guns threatened to upset the status quo among the various clans, and Christianity threatened Japan's belief systems. In 1603, a warlord, Tokugawa Ieyasu, pictured below, decided that it was time for Japan to rid themselves of foreign influence. He unites all the other shoguns under his power. Once these warriors presented a united front against the Europeans, he kicked them out. This started the Edo period, or the Tokugawa shogunate, so named because the shogun set up his rule in the city of Edo, while the emperor remained in the capital of Kyoto. Just as the emperor passed power to his eldest son, so too did the shogun, starting a dynasty of shoguns. During the Tokugawa shogunate, the emperor remained the spiritual leader while the shogun ruled the government and economy. The shogun centralized the government, codified law, and the country enjoyed a period of prosperity. He also forced Christian converts to renounce their new faith or face persecution. Through the banning of European guns, expelling the missionaries, and forbidding the Japanese to leave the islands, he removed most of the foreign influence. However, due to this self-imposed isolation, Japan misses the Industrial Revolution. Except for minimal contact with the Dutch at the trading post in Nagasaki, the Japanese had virtually no contact with foreigners until 1858, when a delegation from the U.S., led by Commodore Matthew Perry, comes to Japan. This unwelcome visit didn't go much better than when the Portuguese came in the 1500s. The U.S., who demanded to see the emperor, were sent to the shogun instead. Over the course of the next 15 years, the U.S. tries to dominate Japan through an imbalance of trade. The Japanese learned some lessons from the situation in China and outlawed the opium trade. They do, however, grant the U.S. most favored nation trading status, which doesn't keep the Europeans out, but gives the U.S. the upper hand in trade with Japan. Unfortunately for the U.S., the Japanese decide that to avoid imperialism, they must modernize on their own. As the old saying goes, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. In 1868, the Japanese overthrow the shogun, whom they blame for both isolating them and for allowing the foreigners in. They restore the power of the emperor in a symbolic and practical gesture. The emperor moves from Kyoto to Edo. They rename the city of Edo by switching the syllables Kyo and To Kyo, thus giving the capital its modern name. Here is a short video that discusses the many changes in Japan that took place during the late 1800s and early 1900s. By 1900, Japan has established itself as the most modern and powerful nation in Asia. Although Japan is quite powerful, it also has a major problem. It lacks natural resources like oil and coal, which is much needed for industrialization. So in order to stay modern, it must buy or import natural resources from other countries. However, it is unable to export or sell enough products to other countries to offset the cost of the raw materials. This is called an unfavorable balance of trade. Therefore, Japan decides to take those natural resources from other places through imperialism. Its first stop is modern-day Okinawa. Following their success in Okinawa and taking advantage of the political upheaval in China, Japan starts the Sino-Japanese War by invading Korea and Manchuria. Unable to defeat the Japanese in part due to the Boxer Rebellion, the Chinese cede these areas to the Japanese, and the Japanese carve out a sphere of influence in China alongside the Europeans. When the Japanese invade Manchuria, the Russians, fearful that the only warm water port in the Pacific will be taken over. Therefore, the Russians and the Japanese go to war. Tsar Nicholas II thought he would make an easy defeat of Japan, a supposedly inferior nation. He hoped that military victory would restore the reputation of the monarchy and divert attention from the domestic issues he faced. Imagine his surprise when the Japanese sink the Russian fleet at a surprise attack at Port Arthur and defeat him in a land battle at Mukden. These embarrassing defeats, coupled with the threat of revolution at home, convinced Nicholas to negotiate a peace deal. Both sides accepted U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt's offer to negotiate the peace. Russia was forced to recognize Japanese rights to Korea and agreed to leave Manchuria. Russia also signed over its 25-year lease on Port Arthur. The impact of Russia's defeat by Japan was felt by oppressed peoples all over the world as it sparked anti-colonial movements, particularly in Africa. Both the Persian Empire, modern-day Iran, and the Ottoman Empire, which was ruled by the Turks and spanned into Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Palestine, were both in decline. Both empires were hereditary monarchies where the Persian Shah, or Ottoman Sultan, ruled with the blessing of their religious leaders. Again, not much different than Europe, except that their religion was Islam, not Christianity. The Persians were Shia and the Ottomans Sunni, but both represented what was left of the once large and very powerful Muslim empires. When oil was discovered in Persia by Britain in 1908, the British and Russians vied for control. Britain was fearful that if Russia was in control of Persia, it might also try for India. Russia was fearful of Britain gaining too much territory in Central Asia. In 1907, after a series of agreements and disputes, they divided Persia into spheres of influence despite Persia's sovereignty. As previously discussed, the Ottoman Empire lost much territory in the 1800s as the minority groups declared independence in the 1800s. In the latter part of the 19th century, the Ottomans tried to modernize its infrastructure and army. However, that cost money. So when the empire filed for bankruptcy in 1875, the British and French stepped in to control their debt. In the early 1900s, it lost much of its Balkan territories, particularly in the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution attempted to restore the 1876 Constitution and a multi-party political system. It only lasted a year before the Sultan regained power and undid the reforms, re-establishing his power. During the Young Turk rule, there was an attempt to assimilate ethnic minorities into a single culture, religion, and national identity. Other languages than Turkish were banned, and those that refused to assimilate were seen as disloyal to the government and were persecuted. This feeling and policies continued even after the Young Turks were no longer in power. During World War I, the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek Christian minorities were executed in genocides, the first of the modern genocides of the century. To this day, Turkey denies that it was genocide. It has often been said that the United States, quote, flirted with imperialism. This implies that somehow we weren't true believers. And perhaps it is an attempt to exonerate us from our actions, or suggest, maybe we weren't as bad as Europe. It is my opinion that we should let the Hawaiians and the Filipinos decide that. In 1795, Hawaii was a unified kingdom under a single ruler, a king whose descendants ruled the islands until 1872. Christian missionaries from the U.S. began converting Hawaiians in the early 1800s. In 1840, Hawaii became a Christian monarchy and drafted a constitution. Throughout the mid to late 1800s, American missionaries and businessmen lived in Hawaii and were active in political affairs. In 1887, the king was forced to sign a new constitution by white businessmen and lawyers, which took away much of his authority. The constitution also limited voting rights to wealthy elites and whites. Then, in 1893, the U.S. minister to the kingdom conspired with U.S. citizens to overthrow the queen. In 1898, Hawaii was annexed and became a U.S. territory until 1959, when it became the 50th state. In the late 1890s, Cuba was pushing for independence from Spain. The U.S. became involved when the American public sided with Cuba, viewing Spain as a tyrannical power much the same as Great Britain had been to the U.S. U.S. businesses also felt threatened as the war interrupted trade with Cuba. The U.S. tried to broker peace, but the Spanish refused. The Spanish offered the Cubans reforms, but the Cubans refused. The USS Maine was sent to Havana Harbor to, quote, ensure the safety of American citizens and interests, end quote. When it exploded, the U.S. declared war on Spain, which they fought on multiple theaters and won in 1898. As a result, the U.S. gained Spain's colonies of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Cuba became a U.S. protectorate, but formed its own civilian government in 1902 and announced independence. However, the U.S. remained involved in Cuban politics until 1959 with the Castro Revolution. When the peace treaty with Spain ceded the Philippines to the U.S., the Filipinos turned their weapons back on the U.S. They had not fought for independence just to be ruled by another foreign power. The U.S. viewed the Filipinos as, quote, ungrateful, as they had helped them gain their independence against the Spanish. The Filipino army was outgunned by the U.S., so they switched to guerrilla warfare. Many civilians were placed in internment camps to keep them from helping the guerrillas. Many died from disease and famine. It is estimated 200,000 Filipinos died in the war. The war officially ended in 1902 when President McKinley established a Congress in the Philippines that had an upper and lower house. The upper house would be run by the Filipino Commission, and the lower house would be elected by Filipinos. The U.S. moved toward a policy of gradual independence for the Filipinos, but for now, the Philippines remained a U.S. territory. Independence would be granted in 1946.